Welcome to Top IBM Security Vulnerabilities, and I'm also going to give you some ideas on how to address some of these challenges. That's always the magic element, right? My name is Robin Tatam. I'm the Director of Security Technologies here at Health Systems. I also am one of the auditors here on staff, and I have a couple of other power certifications under my belt. So what makes me unique, I think, and hopefully in a good position to be able to provide you with this information, is that I am one of the team that puts together the State of IBM security study every year. So we have some pretty good insight into a lot of how these configurations are positioned. And I'll talk a little bit more about that study, give you some insight into where that comes from and how we put that together. And then we'll talk about some of the key takeaways, and I'll give you some of my thoughts on ways that some of those challenges can be approached in order to help get a better handle on IBM security in general. I thought I'd summarize it really into two categories. I've got general challenges that we see frequently and then technical. On the general side, inaction or lack of action when it comes to mitigating security risk is a very common challenge. We also see misconfiguration of the operating system. Things that should be set one way but end up being set a different way. Means that there is potential for that to be resolved, but it takes some action on our part. And then a general lack of skills, funding, and time in the day, good old-fashioned time. These tend to be common challenges for many different areas of IBMI. Certainly there are people that know administration of the platform very well, but when it comes to security, that tends to be a less common skill set. And so developing those skills or acquiring those skills somehow is an initiative that people tend to struggle with a little bit. On the technical side, excessively privileged users is extremely common for us in the IBMI community, as well as not defining any specific database access levels. In other words, as long as you can sign in, you have open access to everything. We also tend to see a lot of reliance on security controls that are no longer relevant, things like menus or policy that says, well, the user can't get to the database, therefore we're safe. Now, in some instances, those outdated security controls do still have some relevance. Menu security, for example, is still something that we promote. Same thing with command line restrictions, but we have to recognize that we can't be fully reliant on those because they're not 100% effective. We see a vast lack of exit programs that are there to monitor PC connections. If the term exit program doesn't mean anything to you, then that's a perfect example of a system that most likely has some exposure in that regard, and we'll talk about that. Oversharing of the integrated file system, the good old IFS, making those drive shares available to the user community, perhaps with shares that are no longer required, or worse yet, the sharing of the root folder of the IFS. We don't ever want that happening. And lastly, just as a summary, not auditing activities, or perhaps alerting when an audit action happens when we see important system or user-based events. It's hard to be compliant with any type of regulation or simply best practices if we don't know what's happening on the box, if we don't know what our users are up to. So how do I know some of these things? Well, I will share with you that I have done assessments of many, many servers over the years, and we do have a tool that assists customers to do this scan as well. That has culled information from well over multiple thousands of servers since its inception back in 2004. We also have a lot of involvement in security projects with customers that we work with, so we see real world examples of their system configuration. Leadership through common and other user groups. I speak extensively around the world about different security concepts for IBMI, and of course have lots of conversations with members of those groups as they ask questions and give feedback and ideas. The one thing we love about IBMI is that we all like to share information. And so that has been a great source of content for me over the years. We've also hosted focus groups and education sessions around the world, meaning that, again, more extension and availability of conversation with IBMI customers. I was also a contributor to the CIS benchmarks that were published last year. If you're not familiar with the CIS benchmarks, think of them as kind of a roadmap of things that you should be looking at on your system, and that will give you a much better handle on security on the box. And a number of years ago, I was part of the IBM Red Books program and contributed to the book on database encryption for IBMI. So I've been around this a long time, and health systems in general has a lot of involvement with these types of focus groups and things. And not least of which, I don't have it listed here, but we also have the State of IBMI security study that I mentioned a few moments ago. Now, this is a report that we have been publishing now for 17, 18 years. It has been published for 2021, so you have access to this study. You can download it from healthsystems.com. And it has a lot of great information, some of which I'm going to be referencing here throughout the remainder of the presentation. The information gathered through the State of Security study is pulled from real world servers. So this is not people's kind of thoughts on security. It's not people's expectation of how they think their system is configured. This is actually pulling system configuration, so we know how that runtime environment is currently set up. The first big hurdle that we have to encounter is that inaction one. And inaction defined as a lack of action where some is either expected or appropriate. For IBMI, security is something that is expected and appropriate. So a lack of action here is definitely a problem, and we've got to get over that hurdle. So why do we see a generalized lack of action for IBMI? Well, one of the first things we have to acknowledge is that people that work on this platform are not exactly renowned for adopting new features, right? We are seeing a general push currently to non-green screen tools, and that's an exciting evolution for the system. But many of these tools have been around for a couple of decades or more, and so it's just interesting to me that we're finally getting our hands and starting to use those tools. Same thing with security. Many of the controls I'm going to talk about today have been around for years, but we just simply haven't done anything with them until we get to a point where security is no longer an option. We also know that there is a perception that the IBMI operating system and the hardware itself is already highly secure and arguably virus proof. Now, that perception isn't necessarily correct. It may be built on a foundation of some level of truth, but we tend to kind of exaggerate the reputation of this machine in a way that leaves us exposed. In fact, we've used that reputation in order to justify sometimes the costs of power technology, right? We know that the initial purchase price of a power server is going to be much more than a cheap off-the-rack type of Intel server. We also know that overall, the total cost of ownership of that power technology tends to be less, which is exciting. But it really just speaks to the fact that power has a lot of integrated features, security being one, database being another. These features often are going to entail additional costs on other platforms. So we have sold management on the virtues of this technology, and we have to acknowledge that we have really positioned that the system is secure, and therefore, why would we need funding to do anything in terms of security? There's also a lack of formal education on security, especially for admins and programmers. I remember when I was writing code that one of the big things that we would do is get that application designed and written as quickly as possible with the minimal amount of bugs. We wanted it in the hands of the users. We wanted it to solve the business challenge that it would have been scoped to do. And we didn't really take the time to sit and go, how does security factor into this? That means the programmers that are out there and building these applications really are just relying on the defaults on the system. And as we're going to see, those defaults are not actually ideal. The system tends to be perceived as a low-risk environment due to the fact that it sits inside the perimeter. We have a firewall around the outside protecting all the internal assets. But let's face it, that doesn't necessarily then speak to what if somebody gets through that perimeter, and or what if they have authority to be inside that perimeter. They are part of the payroll, right? Or on the payroll, and they're an employee or a contractor, and they're already inside the network. We've got to accommodate that fact. But a lot of people think the firewall is going to save the day. I put in here, you mean this menu ain't enough? I did that simply because a lot of people still have that mindset, right? That we have security implemented because our application doesn't let us take an option off of a menu, or even that we've taken command line permission away. And so that perception is something that we have to kind of bend a little bit because it's not 100% true. I left the last one as you tell us. I'm sure there are other reasons why security has never been a big player in the IBMI world, and I'm certainly welcoming if you are willing to share that through the question panel. If you have any thoughts on that as I speak through here, feel free to share those. I did put down here a disclaimer, the integrated security. We don't tend to acknowledge the disclaimers. What I mean by that is we've told management about how great Power is, and I'm a big fan too. And we've told it has integrated security, but we don't say, but it comes with a requirement to do some configuration, right? We just omit that disclaimer from the conversation. One of the first things that I encourage people to do is to assess and prioritize their vulnerabilities. And there are ways to do this that are free of cost, and there are other ways to do this that perhaps are more in depth, but do entail some expense. One thing I do encourage that if you are contracting with someone to take a look at your security environment, make sure that you are validating and checking their credentials to ensure that the assessor is not only familiar with the frameworks and the regulations, but also is familiar with the actual platform itself. We all know IBMI is very unique, and we want to make sure that they have some familiarity with that environment. The first thing we're going to speak to is administrative privileges. These are averages per system. So these are the 8 special authorities that a user could be granted, makes them an admin in essence, even though when we see these numbers, we recognize that there's probably way more than the number of admins that we actually have on staff. Right? 324 for the all object was a big increase this year. So that's something definitely to keep an eye on. The spool control and job control tend to be the first and second numbers, but obviously we had a latecomer to the game here in the all object. And then Safe Sys is another administrative privilege that end users simply do not need. And yet we granted 180 of those users that privilege by default on each individual system. So bear those numbers in line here as we go through. So IBMI is really speaking to administrative privileges as what we call special authority. And as I mentioned, there are 8 of those. The special authorities can be assigned to an individual person or an individual user via a profile attribute. It's called special authorities. And then it also can be inherited from any or all of that user's group profiles. So if I belong to the accounting group and the accounting group has all object, then indirectly I've inherited all object. So we want to be cognizant of that inheritance aspect as well. It's initially assigned based on the user class of the user. There are several templates that we call user classes when you create a new account, such as SecOffer, user, programmer. But the special authority assignment can also be overridden in any permutation and combination. In fact, if you've seen the message at the bottom of your screen, when changing a profile that says the special authorities and user class do not match, it's simply indicating that you have assigned a combination of special authorities that does not align with one of the handful of IBM templates. The big takeaway here is that most users do not need special authorities. And those that do typically don't need them all day, every day. So that is probably the big takeaway here. Understanding that there is probably some cleanup to take place over the existing accounts, right? But we want to stop the bleeding and stop creating new accounts that have those permissions. First thing I recommend as a resolution consideration is to find out who has these permissions. Now, there are third-party tools like our compliance monitor that can do a fantastic job of making this task easy. But even in the absence of a third-party tool, just generate a printout or a table, a file of users that contain or have access to special authorities. The display user profile option is a great way to do that. You want to then experiment with removing unnecessary authorities. I said experiment, but I really mean test, right? It's a controlled environment. We want to make sure that if we remove a special authority that we're not going to cause any unnecessary issues with our application. So this is where most people tend to get a little scared and say, we're not going to break our application. But in many instances, we can take a sample profile and remove the privilege away, and we can really determine whether that is a realistic fear or not. And even if it is a fear or it is realized in the test, it is still possible to remove those permissions. It may just take an additional bit of configuration to do it. Right? You want to evaluate a plan for giving out those authorities when needed. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with all object or save sys per se. It's just the fact that a user that has that permission can literally do anything they need. And the reality is most users don't need that level of authority. But there may be times when they do. So having a plan for giving out those authorities on an as-needed basis is a great thing to think of ahead of time. And that may entail having an emergency access account. You may be using a tool like our authority broker to just step the user's permissions up when needed. Or it could be that there's another account they use or a version of their profile that is disabled most of the time and re-enabled when needed. I also offer that if there is a profile that retains some level of administrative privilege, that you should consider activating command auditing for any of those accounts, especially those that have what we call command line permission. Command line permission relates to a parameter on the user account called limit capabilities. And if it's set to yes, then that means the user can't run commands. But if it's set to no or partial, then that user has access to the command line functions of the system. And so I would track what they're using that command line for. Use the change user audit command. It's separate from the change user profile command to support a separation of duty. Also, I would encourage you to consider tools that will help with the assignment of privileges, the tracking of the use of those privileges, and even things like multi-factor authentication, so that when an admin signs in, we can verify that it is indeed the admin and not somebody just pretending to be that person. The next thing we're going to talk about is the overall security enforcement level. This is referred to as Q security, and you've probably stumbled across that in your exploration of the system. And this is the security enforcement level, which helps ensure that users only have the appropriate permissions according to their user class. Now, it's kind of broken into either security level 20 or below, security level 30 or above, and that will control or dictate which administrative privileges the user is given. It also has influence on the operating system to determine whether the built-in hardware storage protection controls are going to come into play. And what we see is the majority of you are indeed passing this level. Now understand that there are 5 different levels that are available. Level 40 is the default and the shipped setting, and that has been that way now for about 25 years, which makes it interesting that there's still a large portion of people that are failing to meet that default level. Over the years, many of the attributes of the highest level, level 50, have indeed trickled down into level 40. So it's not as critical now for people when they say, should I be at level 50? The answer is you really don't have to be, unless you're a government entity like a Department of Homeland Security in the US or other intelligence agencies. You really are going to be fine running at level 40. The big thing here, the most important advice I can give you, is that there are other factors that influence the effectiveness of this particular setting. As an example, if you take a level 40 system and give or grant all users all object special authority, effectively that system is now operating down at level 20. Conversely, if we take all object away from all the users running on a level 20 server, effectively it's like a level 30 server. Now I went from 40 to 20, but I only went from 20 to 30. Why is that? Well, there are some nuances in level 30 that mean that I can still do some somewhat scary things which are going to be prevented at level 40. So taking all object away doesn't fix all the problems, but certainly takes care of a big chunk. If you're currently at security level 10, I want you to let me know, because I've never seen a system at that level and I'd like to before I retire or curl up. If, however, you're at level 20, and I saw one of these a couple days ago, so they are still out there, be aware that when you go to security level 30, any profile who is not a class of SecOffer will have the all object permission removed from that account. That's why people perceive a big change there. Users who aren't part of the SecOffer or SysOffer class will also lose their save sys permission. Neither of those things are insurmountable. They're not problems as long as the rest of the system is configured correctly. If you're currently at level 30, when you go to level 40 or 50, the operating system's integrity is going to be enforced, meaning that we can't call OS objects directly. We can only go through APIs, and other activities may also be prevented. First thing to do, determine what security level you're at. If you're going from 20 to 30, find out which users are going to be impacted and if authorities are going to be stripped away that's actually relied upon. If you're changing from 30 to 40, probably the most common change, there are a couple of auditing attributes that you can activate, because one of the nuances of being at security level 30 is while it won't enforce some of these challenges, it will log when the violations occur. So you can actually determine if you're going to experience an issue when you get to level 40 before you make that change. So great way to resolve the issues before you commit to the actual change itself. And if you're going directly from level 20 to 40, you've got to consider the impact of both of those levels of changes. So that's a pretty big deal. A lot of people prefer to go in 2 steps, so it's a little bit more manageable. There are instructions in the security reference manual for each OS release on how to accomplish this task. Otherwise, let us know and we would be glad to assist. What about connecting into the box? In many instances, those users can connect too easily. So we're going to talk about default passwords. That's defined as a password that is a mirror of the name of the user. So my user ID is rtatum, my password is rtatum. Not very hard to guess. Now, passwords are required in order to access a user account, and that user account then is going to define what permissions and authorities are associated for the user. It's important to understand that the IBM supplied profiles, typically that start with the letter Q, do not have to have a password, with one exception. QSecOffer has to have a password. You can't set it to *none. The others, QProgrammer, QSysOpper, all the others can be set to password *none, because typically we don't have an expectation of somebody signing in. What we see in the State of Security study is that there are, on average, 160 profiles on each box with default passwords, 71 of them enabled. That's a staggering number. Even if you set your restrictions on, only allowing 2 or 3 of those attempts, chances are one of the first attempts is going to include that default passwords. Remember, passwords tend to be the sole protection of your core system assets. And we want to make sure users are prevented from selecting their username as their password. In fact, the operating system prevents that, but it doesn't stop an admin from doing it. So if you do have default users out there or default passwords on your accounts out there, you can only blame the admins. If for once, you can't blame the end users. If you expire a password when you create a new account, just remember, it's not preventing the profile from being used. It just means the person who signs in first gets to pick the secret version of the password. And maybe that's not the user you're expecting to sign in. Even if you are enforcing the use of strong passwords, right? Long passwords, 16 characters. You got a really good policy there, and I love it. The problem is that users tend to recycle passwords. They put them in for multiple uses, either in your network or on websites or other applications that they may encounter either in their personal lives or professional lives. So we've got to recognize that there's still a risk if those passwords are compromised elsewhere, even if they are strong passwords in structure. We also know that passwords don't prove that the user is actually who they are claiming to be. So I could sign in as Robin, I could sign in as Sandy, another person on my team, and as long as I know the password, the system thinks I am legitimately Sandy. Well, obviously I'm not. So in that instance, we need to think about technology to assist with that. First recommendation is that you print the names of your existing profiles that have a default password. There is a command to do this. It won't tell you what the password is, but you already know because it mirrors the name of the profile. Right? Instruct those users to go out and change their passwords as soon as possible, or you can change and expire it for them. Right? So get that off the table as quickly as possible. Take a look then at your onboarding procedures to make sure that the defaults that your admins are using are not using that as a default option. Even if you use a default password, as noted in the last bullet there, just don't use the IBM default. Have a default that's unique to your organization or the month of the year that you're in, so that at least if somebody gets in from outside, you don't have to worry so much about them causing havoc on the system. If you are on version 7.2 or later of the operating system, then I strongly encourage you to consider use of the QPWD rules system value. That QPassword rule system value lets you put multiple policy settings into one attribute. And if you assign limit profile name in conjunction with all create change, no more default passwords. The limit profile name means that the username can't exist anywhere in the password. The all create change says the admins have to comply with the policy as well as the users. So in essence, we resolve the issue. It does not resolve the issue of the profiles that are already out there. That way they get grandfathered in, so the analyze default password is still something you need to do. All right, let's talk about arguably one of the highest risk elements, which is what I call policing PC connections. Now, we use the term exit programs. I mentioned it a little bit earlier in the summary. The exit programs, in essence, are just programmer-defined functions. It means that an application has been written to do something that the original application was not designed to do. Think of it as user-defined, right? In this case, the user is the programmer. The purpose of an exit program is to augment the existing function. What we want the exit programs to do is to augment object level security when it pertains to TCP/IP connections, things like FTP and ODBC and JDBC. Exit programs should be coded to provide auditing visibility to the transactions, alerting if a transaction is sensitive or possibly denied, and then also to give access control over those transactions. One of the nice things about exit points, which are what invoke the exit programs, is that they give the exit program first right of refusal. So before the operating system does any authority checking, such as do you have all object or is the public authority open, the exit program gets to determine whether that user should even be there in the first place. So if Robin, the end user, has no business justification for making an FTP connection into the box, stop him from doing it, independently of whether he has OS authority to the objects he's trying to access. For many organizations, this is the first layer, the first control that they select. And the reason for that is this sits in the sweet spot where it is easy to implement and it has a dramatic benefit on reducing risk of a errant connection. Now, the thing we see from the graph, the message we get here is that the vast majority of you in the IBMI community are still devoid of exit program protection. There is only a 13% coverage rate on all of the exit points pertaining to TCP/IP connections. That's a staggeringly small number considering this concept has been around since the mid-90s. So if you are going to take away one thing from this today, I want it to be a discussion around exit programs in your shop. Now, exit points are part of the operating system. They don't do anything other than invoke an exit program if it exists. Think of the exit point like a Velcro hook, right? You strip Velcro apart, you got the hooks on one side and the fuzz on the other. Think of the exit point as one of those sides. Let's call it the hooks, and they're embedded throughout the operating system. The exit programs are like the opposing side of that, the fuzz. They're not always necessarily for security because, again, the programmer decides what that function is going to be. But we want that program to do certain things for us specifically. Now, theoretically, you can have malicious exit programs. So be cognizant of having an exit program doesn't fix your security, it just gives you options. If you have a security-centric exit program, this can be a fantastic compensating control if you have poor security controls in other areas. For example, if you have never implemented object-level security and you're a little freaked out about the idea of doing that, exit programs can at least put that protection around the box so that only the users utilizing those interfaces are the ones that are appropriate. These interfaces tend to be the ones that are attacked most frequently. And ironically, they're also the ones that we guard the least. So these are the attack vectors that criminals come into, and yet we have no controls in the vast majority of cases. The big thing for me, and my recommendation is, if you're going to buy or even look at one commercial security tool for your IBMI platform, this is the one you need to look at in all reality, right? Because this is, like I said, going to have the most influence on the amount of risk you're facing. So our resolution considerations is that, first of all, determine if you already have any exit programs deployed. You also want to understand who wrote those programs and the function that they perform. A way to do that is to go into the system registry. The command here, work-reg-inf, will take you into that registry. Scroll down through all of the exit points, and you're going to be looking for one in alphabetical order that starts with QIBM, underscore QTMF underscore server underscore rec. That is going to be the exit point associated with FTP server functions, arguably one of the most common exit points that people protect. So if you're going to have one exit point covered, it's probably this one. Use option 8 and it'll tell you if there's an exit program already assigned. You then want to consider evaluating an exit program-based solution. Yes, Help Systems does have one, but this is something that is strongly recommended and you should take a look at. Deploy that solution, maintain the rules within that solution, and oh, by the way, did I talk to you about exit program solutions? That's how important this is to me. I think it is such a critical component that if you don't have it, or if you only have partial coverage of the approximate 30 different channels in and out of the system, then this is probably where you're going to be most exposed. All right. Let's talk about the IFS for a moment. The integrated file system is something that we have dealt with in some capacity for the last, I don't know, 20, 25 years. And it's something that we want to consider from a protection standpoint for sure. Now, viruses are a little bit of a controversial idea to us in the IBMI community because we have been taught over the years, at least in some capacity, that you can't get a virus on this box. But the reality is actually IBM has never claimed that the IFS is virus proof. In fact, they gave us integrated scan support in the IFS back in version 5 of the operating system. The operating system actually has 2 system values, starting with qscan, and then 2 exit points, 2 more exit points, I should say, pertaining to scanning a file when it's opened or scanning a file when it's closed. IBMI requires the IFS in order to function. So if you're sitting there thinking, thank goodness we're still all green screen, we don't need the IFS, be careful. The operating system actually has a requirement for the IFS. It is true that viruses can make it through to the integrated file system, in many instances through some type of file transfer, or more commonly from a drive mapping to the IFS structures. It is true that native objects such as RPG programs, physical files, query definitions, things like that are immune from being infected. That does not mean they're immune from being impacted. So things like deletes, renames, moves of objects can still be implemented on a native object too. If you have high availability, don't close your eyes yet because it's not all fun and games. High availability is intended to make a backup system look exactly like the primary. And if you cause an issue, malicious or otherwise, on the primary system, HA is going to take care of doing that same action on the backup machine. Understand that there are no custom IBMI viruses. These are the same viruses that are hitting all the other platforms. Right? Now, how they impact the system is a little bit different. You can't execute a Windows executable on the IFS itself. So we have some level of protection here, but we've just got to be careful that we truly understand the nuances of that. Right? There's a reason that IBM created antivirus features in the operating system. They would not have taken the time to do that if this was a zero exposure item. However, there's a piece missing out of that infrastructure, and that's the actual scan engine. And if you're interested in seeing more about this, we do webinars on this topic, and I do have screenshot examples of people that have been impacted by viruses in pretty dramatic ways. So think about what IFS drive shares you have out there that are defined. If you're using Navigator for I, then this is how they get created. So you could use that to, in essence, monitor to see what shares are defined, and then you can do a little bit of research as to whether they're still required. Was this share defined 15 years ago and it's no longer needed? Is there a share to root, which is the huge golden rule number 1 that we tell people to never do? Never share that root folder. Define your drive shares as read-only whenever you possibly can so that at least there is no risk of the data on the system being harmed. And there's also an authorization list that you should consider locking down. It's called QPWF server, listed in the 4th bullet there. And that authorization list is designed exclusively to protect against users drilling into qsys.lib, which is a folder that sits under the root and contains all of your native applications. It's the operating system, it's your production library, it's all your RPG programs, it's your user accounts, it's literally everything. Now, the QPWF server, understand, is not going to prevent an all object user from getting through that door. That's part of the reason we don't want people carrying all object. But if the user doesn't have all object, the QPWF server is a great way of saying, okay, you can access this folder, but you can't go into qsys.lib. Of course, if you followed golden rule number 1, the user wouldn't be in the root folder anyway to even have that option. Of course, with the IBM security controls for an antivirus engine, we recommend that you evaluate and deploy a native antivirus scan engine. Now, I capitalize the word native. Don't map a drive from a Windows server or your PC and start scanning that way. That can be extremely problematic and extremely intensive on the network bandwidth. So we want you to do the scan, but we want you to do it from the inside out, not the outside in. And so using a native scan engine is the only viable option. We also want to consider use of an exit program. We just talked about those, remember, to control access to your system. There is a file server exit point. And so having an exit program on that can ensure that only the appropriate users are connecting into your file shares, that they are only performing desirable tasks instead of create stream file, delete stream file, rename stream file. All of those things can be controlled through the exit program rules. All right, next we're going to talk about auditing, logging activities on the system. The good news is IBMI has extensive auditing features, which allow us to quite simply audit system-based events, as well as things that are being done by individual users, and even touch points on specific sensitive objects. The log itself is known as the audit journal, sometimes referred to as QAudJourn. So if you've heard those terms, we're all talking about the same thing. The audit data itself is actually not stored in the audit journal. It's stored in journal receivers. So think of the audit journal as the funnel over a conveyor belt, and the journal receivers as the containers that hold the events. When the container becomes full, the operating system will move the conveyor belt and give us a fresh receiver to start filling up. The big consideration is that the system does not audit by default. This function is not active on a virgin vanilla system. And the good news is 84% of you knew that and have turned it on. 16%, however, have no visibility to anything happening on that system, which is a little bit frightening. It's important to know that auditing will typically not degrade performance. However, it will eat up your disk space if you leave that data out there forever. Auditing can and arguably should be tuned. It's not all or nothing. You can dial it up or dial it down. A lot of customers that I talk to go to a session, a common or a user group, and they go, hey, I've heard about this auditing function, we need to turn it on. And they turn it on full pelt. And then they wonder why they're drowning in these events and the disk is quickly being consumed. And they turn it back off and swear that they should never have turned it on and they'll never do that again. But the reality is they should have dialed it up. And even if they didn't, they turned it on full bore, then dial it down, don't just shut it off. It is possible to load up a tool to do forensic analysis after an event has occurred, but understand that if you weren't logging those types of events in the first place, it's pretty much game over. Your hands are tied. You can't recreate an event that's not there. You should have policies to dictate the collection of the data, the alerting from events that are critical in that data, and then of course the archiving and retention policy. How long do you keep that data out there? Where do you store it? How are you using it? You cannot detect any type of security violation without that auditing being active, right? So if you want to have some chance of knowing that bad things are happening, that free auditing function has to be turned on. High availability tools sometimes will do that on your behalf. So if you're using some of the well-known software replication tools for high availability, there's a very good chance your auditing is turned on. In fact, that 84% of people that have it active, sadly, I would say that the majority of them didn't turn the auditing on themselves, some other function did. First thing is to determine if you've ever turned it on. Do a work object and look for the audit journal. Once it's created, typically it will stay on the box even if you subsequently turn the auditing off. So this is just telling us that at some stage it was on. After we know that it's been turned on, we want to look at a couple of system values to determine if it's currently logging. The QAud control system value is like the on-off switch. The QAud level and QAud level 2, which are really related, are going to define the types of events that are being logged. And so all those things work together to indicate what type of activity should happen. Develop a plan to fire that auditing function up. The thing to be aware of is that by default, IBM says when you start auditing, we're going to log the data into library QGPL. General purpose library. I would offer this is not general purpose data, so not a great location for it. Consider creating a library specifically to house audit journal data and then fire it up there. If you're already collecting data and you like that idea, it is possible to relocate or redirect those events into a new library. So let me know and we can give you some direction on that. Once you have the data being collected, you should consider or evaluate a method to help you alert or at least report on the events that are happening. This is typically done through third-party tools, as most people don't want to do that themselves. And there's a number of third-party tools on the market to help you, whether it is just running reports or sending that data to a syslog server in order to get somebody's awareness in an immediate term. I had a customer that did a security evaluation with us about 1.5 years ago. And during that evaluation, I had to reveal to them that one of the profiles on their system, on a production system, had been hit over 99 million times with incorrect password. Now, granted, that profile had become disabled. However, the fact that somebody tried that many times is something that should be known to the security team, not revealed to them by somebody during a free assessment. So having visibility is absolutely critical. All right, there's lots more stats that I could share with you, but I know we're running out of time here. I put today and in general, I obviously only have limited amount of time on this webinar, but you only also have limited amount of time before somebody discovers these common vulnerabilities and exploits them. So take advantage of the security study to determine some of the common areas that we see where people have misconfigured or not configured the system, and understand that you don't have to fix them all on day one. Chances are you wouldn't be able to even if you thought that was a great idea. Slow and steady wins the race here. Just chip away at it. You can make a dent in this stuff fairly quickly, but you have to start somewhere. There was a new motivator added to the list in 2020. I mentioned CIS benchmarks. This is, in essence, a set of documents. There is one for version 7.2, 7.3, and one for 7.4 that speak to the various vulnerabilities that a group of experts have determined is relevant to IBMI. Now, this is a great asset to us in the IBMI community because it finally gives us some base standards to adhere to. Yes, great, but we got to make sure that we're one of the first to the table because the CIS benchmarks are publicly accessible, which means your auditor now has that same visibility. And perhaps even worse, the bad guys have visibility to it. So they know default passwords and what defines a default password and the fact that they're very common, as an example. So utilize the benchmarks, but get there quickly. Don't let the bad guy use that against you and cause that as a problem. All right, if you are looking for help in this department, if you're not overly comfortable with security or you would like somebody just to give it a second glance, there are a number of resources available through health systems. What I'd like to start with is just what we call a security scan. Now, this security scan is an activity that we perform at no cost to you and no obligation. So this is a great way to kind of just see at a glance, how is your system set up? We'll rank the risk. We will give you a report out of it. It's typically a 12, 13 page report. Here you see the summary page, and it's going to give you a clear indication of whether your system is well configured or poorly configured. Now, this is a great way to help justify expenditure. We know security projects typically come at an expense, so we have to build that business case in order to be able to do any mitigation. But first step of that is determining, well, what mitigation is required. How extensive is it? How much is it going to cost? Because if you just go to management and say, we need to fix security, they're going to say, well, that's great, but what's it going to cost me? So this is the first step in that process. You can sign up through that nice little URL there. Otherwise, just go out to healthsystems.com and you can find it. But you know what? What I'm going to do here is, if you are interested in doing this, I'm going to open up a poll that just lets you ping back and say whether you're interested in doing that. If you'd like some more information about what it all entails, just so that you are comfortable in what the function is, what data is gathered, how it's gathered, what happens to that data, then we'd be happy to give you some background on that function. But we have done thousands of these for companies large and small, from countries from Manila's not a country, but Singapore to the UK to all across Europe and pretty much every state in the US over the last 15, 16 plus years. And we would love to make that available to you as well. If you've done one before and you felt that it was valuable, but it's been, let's say, a year or more since that was done, feel free. You can absolutely run another one. We will cover the data with you if you'd like. We'll sit down and we'll explain exactly what it means, and we don't charge for that function either. So if you said yes, we'll get in touch. If you said maybe, we'll get you more data. And if you said no, thank you for giving us that feedback. If you change your mind, you can certainly go out to helpsystems.com at any time and you can sign up for it there. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close that out. And I'm just gonna leave you with a thank you and an invitation. If you have any questions, please send those through to the question panel. I'd be happy to answer that. Travis, you asked a question. Do you recommend single sign-on as a way to get away from passwords? Well, yes, potentially. If you're not familiar with single sign-on, it's a concept whereby you no longer need a password to sign on to your IBM I. Well, how does that make you more secure? Well, you're still authenticating to something. It's typically going to be your Windows domain. We call it oftentimes a Kerberos server, and IBM I can play that role, but for many of us, we use Active Directory for that purpose. So it basically means once we authenticate to our Windows network, when we go into the IBM I, then it passes what's really called a Kerberos ticket rather than a password. The user doesn't have to enter it. It's all happening under the covers. And the system knows who you are and it will sign you in. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, those tickets expire, so it can be a pretty robust and secure way. It gets the password issue out of the hands of the user. They don't have to worry about, oh, got another password to remember, and all the nuances of writing it down or you're recycling one from before. So I am kind of a fan of single sign-on in being able to do that. However, there are some things to consider. Typically in IBM I, not all profiles are going to use single sign-on. So if your end users, for example, are going to use that as a technique, that's great, but your admins may not. So you still want to have good password policy in place for the people not using single sign-on. All right, so that's just one of the several considerations that you need there. All right, any other questions people have? And it doesn't necessarily even have to be related to the content from today. If you have a general security question, heck, if you have a question in general, I'm an avid photographer. I can answer any photography questions you might have. All right, if there are no other questions, or if you're too shy, or if you'd like to ask offline, feel free to reach out and do that at any time. We're always available to share expertise, give you background in any of the topics that I've mentioned. That's hopefully one of the big value adds that Help Systems brings to the table. It's not just about all of the software tools that we have in our portfolio, of which there are many, but it's also about the expertise of the staff. We have so much tenure on the IBM platform. We have multiple IBM champions recognized here at Help Systems. I'm one of those, but I'm not alone in that. We have some great resources around the world that can be brought to the table to help you have a discussion around these topics. And I invite you to take advantage of that. All right, I'm going to give you a few minutes back in your day. I appreciate you joining me. Hopefully this was valuable to everybody, and I look forward to seeing you on another session coming up. All right, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.